I'm Jerry Sparks, president of AG Financial Insurance Solutions, and I'm a certified insurance counselor, certified risk manager, and welcome to our first Risk Management Live. This will be the first of many where we're providing timely information in regards to risk management. I have today with us Rich Hammer, who is actually General Counsel to the General Council of the Assemblies of God. He's a Harvard Law graduate, an attorney, CPA, author of the Church Law and Tax Report, certified diesel mechanic, and an astronomer. And we're glad to have Rich here. And we're going to
member of the National Geographic Society.
Okay, and member of the National Geographic Society. So we're here today actually to talk about in the wake of the scandal of the Penn State University and the Gerald Sandusky case, which Louis Freeh, the former FBI director, was appointed by Penn State in a task force to come up with some of the key findings of what was happening at Penn State and what were some of the problems that happened. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about that. And Rich, go ahead, if you would, give us the key findings of that report, if you would.
Well, Jerry, let's step back several months when the allegations, the revelations regarding Jerry Sandusky were first publicized. Penn State was reeling in chaos and confusion. They became the center of a media feeding frenzy. And how in the world can they respond to this? So the Board of Trustees of Penn State decided that they would appoint a task force to do a comprehensive evaluation of all university policies and procedures, especially those pertaining to minors. You say, well, where are the minors at Penn State? Well, they had numerous programs involving minors. During the summer, they had camps, they had all kinds of activities. Some of them were overnight, some of them were just during the day. But so they appointed this task force that was headed up, as you said, Jerry, by former FBI Director Louis Freeh. This task force consisted of attorneys, federal prosecutors, FBI agents. This is, and I think it's important to say this at the outset, probably the most impressive group of people to ever focus on the issue of how does a youth-serving charity protect minors. That's very important because I suspect that going forward, we're going to see plaintiffs' attorneys that sue churches because of cases of child molestation make the argument, look at all the ways that your church's policies didn't measure up to the task force in the Penn State case. Because of the august nature of this task force, I think this is going to more or less set the best practices in the minds of many attorneys and juries with regard to what other youth-serving charities, including churches, need to be doing. That's why it's important for you to be familiar with some of the key findings of this report. And let me just say this, that education ultimately is a means of transforming human behavior. And for education in the church context to be successful, it needs to be intentional, it needs to be systematic, and it needs to be sustained. And that word sustained is very critical because education is not a one-time deal. You don't listen to this presentation today and say, okay, I know everything I need to know. Education, to be effective, has got to be sustained over time. That's why we're coming back, Jerry, and doing these on a monthly basis to keep you, church leaders, fully informed, as you said, with regard to current developments. And if we don't think there's a current development that's noteworthy, we'll be dealing with other issues of risk management to equip the church to respond to the unique and pressing risks that face us today. So, any comments?
One of the nice things about this also is that we're going to let you guys be involved as the audience, in that you guys can ask questions right underneath where you're watching this. There is a question box, and those questions will actually feed to us. So if you have questions, we'll take care of those questions and try to answer your questions to provide you information that you need also. So it actually works out that they get to be involved in this live seminar as well. So we're going to provide timely information, give them the information, how it affects their ministry, what changes may need to happen in their ministry to take care of things that came through in this report.
Okay, good. Well, let's go ahead and talk about some of these recommendations. that were, by the way, these were just published a month ago. So this is one of these current developments that we had something else designed for this first inaugural presentation, but we eventually decided, hey, we need to look at something like this because it is so timely and so relevant. Let me talk about some of these recommendations. There were 120 recommendations. So we got to talk fast, Jerry, to get through this list today. But happily, I can tell you, we're going to cover the important ones, 10 or 15 of the most important ones, just briefly, most of them. We've left out over 100 simply because they're not as critical as these. So let's take a look at some of them. One of them was benchmarking your policies with other institutions. That is such an important point. What does that mean? Benchmarking means comparing what you're doing in your church with regard to youth protection policies with what other youth-serving charities in your community are doing. Who would that be? The public schools, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, Boys Clubs, Girls Clubs, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, youth soccer, Little League. There's all kinds of them. And not that you have to track down every one of them, but certainly you want to look at what your public schools are doing because they're an instrumentality of the state. And so how can you be negligent if your policies mirror what your state schools do with respect to the protection of children? And then I would recommend that you add a couple of other prominent national youth-serving charities that have affiliates in your community and record and make a record of what you're doing, because what you're doing is building the case that you are exercising reasonable care with regard to your policies. So I think that's a very important recommendation made by this report. Let me mention some other ones. Of course, updating, standardizing, centralizing, and monitoring your background check procedures, requiring updated background checks for employees and volunteers. And Jerry, this is interesting, every 5 years. I'm often asked by church leaders, how often do we repeat a background check? And by the way, the Louis Freeh report defined background check to include a national sex offender check, number one, number two, a national criminal file check, and that was it. And then there's a number of other things that you can do based on the nature of a position. For example, for some positions they recommend, in addition to those first two, a verification of education, which by the way is the most commonly misrepresented statement on any employee application, is a person's educational attainments. And then there are a number of other positions, people that have access to finances, a credit check, and et cetera. And then a motor vehicle check for people that are going to be driving. But the key things for the church would be the National Sex Offender Registry check, which you can do this yourself by going to a website called nsopw.gov. It's maintained by the Department of Justice. I know many of you didn't get that. Let me say it again. nsopw.gov. That stands for National Sex Offender Public Website .gov, nsopw.gov. Doesn't require any fee, doesn't require signed consent by the individual, doesn't require social security number. All you need is the person's name. Be sure you click on national. You don't want to do a state check. Some courts have ruled that churches were negligent for only doing a local, county, or even a state check, given the mobility of our society today. So a core recommendation here is doing these background checks. Does your church do background checks for every volunteer and employee? And I think that's a very important question for you. And to the extent that you don't, you're falling behind in terms of the emergent best practices for youth-serving charities.
Rich, let me stop you there, because actually one of the things we have done from a risk management standpoint is we try to make sure that churches are actually doing background checks. And one of the things that we are asked all the time is, how often do we do this? And actually I said, whatever your plan is, you need to stick with it. So a lot of times what we have done is just say, if you're going to do it once and stick to it, then that was good enough, until probably this case right here where they've came up with the 5 years.
I was surprised by that, Jerry, and here's why I say that. You look at your typical church in let's say you're in a small community, rural, suburban. I mean, what is the possibility that that third grade Sunday school teacher you have can molest a child, be charged, investigated, indicted, prosecuted, convicted, sentenced, serve the sentence, and nobody in the church knows about it? And I think that's the reason that many youth-serving charities don't repeat these checks, and that's why this came as kind of a surprising recommendation. Here's what I would recommend. Do that benchmarking. Does your public school down the street, elementary school, do they require criminal records checks that are state mandated to be repeated every 5 years, every 2 years, every 10? Do they require any repetition at all? That's a good place for you to start. What about these other youth-serving charities? And you know, if you find out that all of them that you contact are not doing any repeat checks, that could be used as evidence that it's reasonable, that you're satisfying the community standard of reasonable care. You may decide we want to do it anyway because we just have such a high view of our duty to protect minors, and that's fine. I would never quibble with that. But I think we're in the process now of seeing, especially with this free report, that maybe the ground is shifting a little bit, and maybe we need to be thinking in terms of repeating these checks, especially if you're in an urban area. Because many parts of our country, counties are kind of jammed together, and literally it's possible for you to have somebody in your church that is prosecuted, convicted, maybe put on parole in an adjoining county, and you don't necessarily know about it. So especially in urban areas, I think this is a good recommendation to repeat. I would never recommend not complying with this recommendation, and we'll just see what the courts do in terms of finding churches liable that don't do repeats. I've never seen that happen yet in any reported case. Let me just conclude this section with this. Doing the National Sex Offender Public Website search and doing a National Criminal File check are not the only things that you want to do as part of a background check. Critical is getting references. And when I say references, I don't mean from individuals you never heard of before in another state. I mean institutional references. Where has this person worked with minors before? Another church, another youth-serving charity, coaching, teaching, scouting, etc. Just imagine of the value of getting 2 or 3 references on this person from institutions that have used him in working with minors that say, we don't know of any reason why this person would not be suitable for working with minors in your church. That is the gold standard. Most sex offenders don't have a criminal record. So we see here that adequate screening, background checks is multifaceted, it's systematic, and it involves several components. But I don't want to lose sight here, and this is one of the deficiencies in the free report, in my opinion, by not mentioning institutional references.
One of the things that we will make available to everybody is we do have a form that asks the 4 questions that we'll ask for references, that you can ask your references, and we'll make that form available to everybody on the agfinancial.org website. One of the other things that came out, and this happened a few years back, and actually reading about the free report kind of touches on it, is that Sandusky had the chance of getting children alone, and that's one of the things they really slammed the university for, is the ability for him to have use of the facility at all times after some of the convictions, actually, and after some of the people knew about it. One of the states, California, I know, came up with a finding that if a person has keys or the chance of getting a child alone, that they need to have background checks, and that was not happening before that time. So in addition to just volunteers and volunteers that work with children and employees, a person that has the key or the opportunity to get a child alone should also go through a background check and reference check also.
Exactly. I recommend that any employee that has keys to the church you need to go through the same background check that you do with a kindergarten teacher or any youth or children's worker. So that's a good point. They have access. They can access the building when nobody's there. That's not a good situation to be in. You do have a duty there, I think, to do a check. A couple other points in the free report, the recommendations would be retrieving keys and means of access to the building when an employee or volunteer leaves. Many churches now have keypads where you dial in a security number. you have got to make sure that when somebody leaves the church as an employee or children or youth worker, volunteer, that you cut off their means of access to the church. Now, it's easy to do. It's a keypad. You just regularly, periodically change the code. With keys, it's much more difficult, having to change all the locks in the building. There, you want to just be sure you get the key back physically from that person. Here's another one. Hire a permanent general counsel. Boy, that's a great recommendation. It's like I say when churches ask me, what's the sleeping arrangement when we send a youth group on an overnight trip? I say, I recommend you have 4 people in each hotel room. 1 child and 3 adults, and those 3 adults should all be attorneys. And that's a good way to it. You got to use some common sense here. Lighten up out there. So what I'm talking about is you're not going to hire an attorney, most of you, but I think what we can learn from this, it's good to establish a relationship with an attorney that you can contact when issues come up. Rather than say, well, who do we contact, and go to the yellow pages. Develop a relationship. Maybe you have one in your church. Many of you do. But if you don't, you need to form a relationship with a local attorney that you can contact when these issues come up. Another interesting one, Jerry, was rotating committee members, term limiting committee members, and we could expand that to be board members. Here's the problem. The free report referred to Penn State as exhibiting a culture of reverence, because of the football program. That dominated the university. And because of that, people were not inclined to raise questions that could in some way diminish this culture of reverence. And so to kind of break that stranglehold, one of the recommendations was have term limits for committee, and I think we can extrapolate that to mean board members as well. We see the same thing in churches, don't we? In some churches, there is a culture of reverence with regard to the senior or lead pastor. That can be a dangerous thing, especially when you have a board that is lifetime appointment or there for many, many, many years. Are you really having a fully functioning board, or is there that culture of reverence?
One of the things that I thought was interesting in the NCAA in handing down the sanctions and the penalties against Penn State, they did $60 million in fines against Penn State, but one of the big things, again, was the reverence that Penn State held its football program. The head of the NCAA said football will never again be placed ahead of educating, nurturing, and protecting young people, and that was Emmert is who said that. I think we could put it back and say church will not be placed ahead of educating, nurturing, and protecting young people. We have to make sure that we're protecting those children in the church.
Or the pastor. Yeah, that's right. That's good. Well, just a few other of these recommendations. Of course, periodic review of all policies, determining the adequacy of policies. For example, from time to time, check out the service that you're using to do those national criminal file records checks. Is that still regarded as a competent screening service? You can find that out many times just by doing internet searches, but talk to your insurance agent, talk to other churches in your community. Who are they using to do these checks? Talk to the public schools. Of course, most of them are going to be using the FBI checks, which are not accessible by churches typically. Establish a committee on risk. For risk to be something that's not just out there somewhere, that we swerve into it every now and then when we have a problem, but have a dedicated committee that is appointed for the purpose of evaluating risks in the church and suggesting means of managing those risks to the governing leadership of the church.
Rich, we have a question in regards to the board, since I know this report actually really slammed the board of Penn State, and we actually have a question that says, my state has a charitable immunity law. Will this protect my church board?
That's an excellent question. Every state has a charitable immunity law, and as does the federal government, the Volunteer Protection Act of 1997, that basically all say the same thing, that uncompensated board members of nonprofit organizations have limited immunity from liability. And what that means is you can't be liable for your actions or decisions as a member of that board unless you act with gross negligence, which borders on reckless behavior, just willful rejection of risks. And we see this happening with churches where a church board has said, we don't need to have a screening policy. This is all nonsense, what we're talking about here today. We haven't been sued. That mentality by that board is subjecting that very board to potential personal liability, because the court's going to likely find that to be recklessness or gross negligence. So a couple things here. Number one, if you're compensated, you're going to lose your valuable protection under state and federal law. You can be reimbursed travel expenses. Many of you serve on not just your church board, but boards of other charities. And in some cases, you may receive some token remuneration. Just understand that that decision to accept that, or the decision by the charity to pay it, is really compromising and jeopardizing a very valuable protection. That's why, as a member of my church board, we have an annual banquet at a restaurant, and I always bring a sack lunch with me so that I am not waiving my valuable protection, Jerry. It really makes the rest of the board feel, oh, there he goes again. So, no, really, lighten up out there. I don't take it that far, but believe me, I sit there and eat that dinner with unease, because I don't know, is this the mess of pottage that's going to destroy my birthright? And so that's just something. But so here's the point. Yes, you have limited immunity. So can boards be liable for cases of child molestation in the church? Not if they act with reasonable care. Only if they have acted with gross negligence. And we've seen a number of cases where board members actually were dragged in and named as defendants on the basis that they were engaged in reckless behavior. I just reviewed a lawsuit just yesterday, Jerry, and I think you've seen this one, where a church board was being sued personally because they allowed the church to continue to use a 15-passenger van. And that church had a van roll over, several people were injured, one killed, and the argument was that's being made in that case is the board members, what a shock. Here they are minding their own business, and they get served a lawsuit, these 8 board members, saying you're personally liable, your home, your bank account, your retirement fund, because of your gross negligence in not adequately evaluating the risk posed by 15-passenger vans and managing that risk.
Being a board member for your church, we suggest that if you're a board member, ask your church, do they have directors and officers liability? Would you serve on a church that didn't have directors and officers liability, or any charitable entity that did not have board and directors and officers liability?
I'd be inclined not to, of course.
Okay.
So that's wouldn't you say that's a rather uncommon form of insurance coverage for churches?
I know that a lot of people say, because we have the charitable immunity law, they don't feel like it's necessary. And like you said, because of gross negligence, and actually looking at this report, that's what they're saying, is that the board did not do their job. Mm-hmm. The board did not even know about these instances when this happened. I know that 2 of the people that did know are actually there's been lawsuits brought against them now. The president lost his job. Joe Paterno, who was one of the winningest football coaches in history, got stripped of all of his victories, and of course was fired. And so this is a big deal.
Who could have imagined that a year ago? Well, anyway, one other thing I want to mention about the report, and then we can take some of these questions that have come in, is, so let me just back up to that question that we just asked. Are you compensated as a board member? If you're not, you're protected by the limited immunity under state and federal law, meaning you can't be liable unless you act with gross negligence. That's why it's important to do the benchmarking, to find out what other charities are doing, and to update your policies accordingly based on the community standard that you're going to discover by benchmarking the practice of other charities in your community. Another interesting thing about this report is that the report as an appendix has several policies that Penn State has adopted, some of them in the wake of the Sandusky revelations. And I just want to refer to one of those reports. It's policy number 39, dealing with protection of minors that are on campus because of some university activity. And I found this to be extremely helpful in addressing a number of issues that are of paramount interest to church leaders. Let me just mention some of the things it covers. Having a proper medical authorization form signed by parents or legal guardians, and what should be in that document. I'm constantly asked that question. The administration of medicines to children. I'm asked that question frequently. Can we give medication to a child during a church overnight activity, for example? What about, oh boy, how about this? What about media releases? And again, this policy recommends, in the course of registering a minor, the parent or guardian should sign a release authorizing the charity to use video or pictorial images of their child for various purposes, church promotion, etc. Very common question that I receive. Oh, here's another one. What ratios should we have? How many adults per child? Well, I've told you my opinion. 3 adults and 1 child per room, and 3 of those adults should be attorneys. But boy, isn't that practical? That's what we're doing here in this presentation. Practical advice for you, the church leader. But anyway, that's an important point. This policy lists ratios of adults to children, and again, your state's going to have similar documentation, maybe your state university, your local state university, or nearby state university, and you can find what the recommendations are with regard to that. Again, if you tie yourself to ratios that have been adopted, especially by a state instrumentality, how can you be viewed as negligent? It would be very difficult to make that case. The 2-adult rule this policy talks about. I've been advocating that for 20 years, making sure that there's no one-on-one association between an adult and child. Here's a good one. Prohibiting electronic contact between adults and minors. Well, how about that? So no social media for adult volunteers or employees that work in a youth-serving capacity to have direct contact with minors. That's really, I teach a 5th grade Sunday school class. I've done it for 25 years. And a few years ago, I started sending out email summaries each week. Well, they're not summaries, they're 3 or 4 pages long, of what we did in class. It's such a multifaceted class. How can I summarize it in 1 paragraph? And so it's important there to know that I did not send those summaries to children. It was, I got the email of all the parents. And I do not have email contact with children. But I don't think my church even has a policy on that. But here's an example of how we can learn from the Penn State experience. Specific recommendations with regard to overnight activities, no corporal punishment. Here's another good one that's very important for churches, is prohibiting adults from picking up minors. Now, these are adults that work in some children's ministry in the church. They can't pick up kids and take them to church or take them home unless it's their own biological child. So those are some of the aspects of this Policy 39 that was appended to the free report that I found to be quite remarkable. I'm doing an article on all of this discussion today for the next issue of my Church Law and Tax Report newsletter.
Mandatory reporting. I know that 2 of the people that did get arrested are actually ensued is because they failed to report. Let's talk about mandatory reporting, and I know that this kind of fell through the cracks because 2 of the people that knew about this, which was I forget their names, but they did not report this to anybody. The board did not know about it. I know that they did notify the campus police, but not the police. So let's talk about reporting, because I do get questions from pastors. I had this incident. Am I required to tell this incident to somebody?
Well, that's such a common question. I'm convinced, we mentioned this before the presentation today, if you'd pick out 100 pastors at random and ask them to describe the child abuse reporting law in their state, who's a mandatory reporter, and what is reportable child abuse. I don't know if you find one that would know the answer to that. This is so, I know, because I talk to hundreds of these people a year. It's so common for pastors to not have a clue as to what the answer to those questions might be. I have an appendix in volume 1 of my 4-volume resource, Pastor, Church, and Law, that does list the child abuse reporting laws of all 50 states. It's also in a newsletter, a special report on my website, churchlawandtax.com, that you can see that. And it tells you who are mandatory reporters in your state. Is there an exemption for privileged communications? And where do you report? So that's very important. But in many states, about 41 states, in fact, pastors are mandatory reporters of child abuse. And the fact that you're not doesn't mean you don't report. It just means you can't be criminally liable for a misdemeanor if you don't report. I have never, in thousands of these calls, pastors asking me, should I report this abuse? I've never told the pastor not to report. I take a very aggressive position with respect to this issue. I can tell you right now, if you're going to call me and ask me, do you need to report an incident of abuse? I can tell you right now, the answer is going to be yes, report it. So that's a very important point. In 41 states, ministers are mandatory reporters, but in about half of those states, you are given an exemption from reporting if you learn of the abuse in the course of a conversation protected by the clergy penitent privilege, meaning it was in the course of confidential spiritual counseling with somebody typically confessing. So there you go. That's kind of the lay of the land when it comes to mandatory reporting. But it's very important, certainly if you're a mandatory reporter, that you report, because a failure to do so may subject your church to potential, and to you personally, to potential liability.
Let's look at a couple questions. From Sandy I got let's see here. So does feeding the board meals cause them not to have limited liability? So you put yourself out there, so.
Well, I would say, number one, look at your state law. Some laws put a dollar limit on it. I think some states say under $500 is okay. It's only if it's more than that. So number one, look and see if you have a threshold, like a de minimis threshold, that you can give things up to a certain amount. Not all states have that. And in some states, like mine, potentially, I don't want to, do you want to take chances here? That's why I have to admit to you, I do eat those dinners. But I feel very uneasy about it. It's not a pleasant experience for me. That's what the law does. Who was it that said, Bernard of Clairvaux, that hell is a place of laws? I live there every day.
One other thing, one of the questions we have is it okay for men to work in a nursery?
I've done it myself for 6 years. I've worked in the nursery. Now I say it was the toddler. I wasn't in the baby nursery. I learned a lot from that assignment. But the key is this: yes, men can work in a nursery as long as you have other adults there, and that person cannot possibly be alone with a child. I'm not opposed to it. I think it's a very positive thing to have a married couple there as an example or a model to the children. You say, well, couldn't the wife cover for the husband who's a pedophile? Yes, that's a risk, but it's a low risk, and the best would be to have unrelated adults. But the risk, I don't believe, goes up significantly if it's a married couple, especially if there's a third person there. So that's a good question. A lot of these questions are difficult, aren't they, to deal with? But one thing you could do is benchmark. Look at what other charities do. Do they allow married couples? Do they allow men to be involved? Well, look at Boy Scouts. There's a lot of youth-serving charities that look at Big Brothers. Look at boys' clubs. There's a lot of charities that allow males to be introduced. And why? Because they've done thorough screening. to determine this person's fitness and suitability for working with minors. So yes, there's a risk, but the question is always, can you manage the risk to tolerable levels?
Absolutely. And I've actually worked in the nursery for close to 15 years, so we just had a rule that I can't change diapers anymore. So, and I'm okay with
Suffer
that.
the little children to come unto me, and forbid them not, for of such is the kingdom of heaven.
One of the things that Sandy asked, is this session going to be taped? And so can I share it with my church leadership in the future? And absolutely, this is going to be taped. It is going to be on the website that you're on right now. And if you would like to get future references of what's going to be happening in the months to come, you can actually sign up with your email address to the right of this little picture right here, and you can sign up for future events and what we're going to be talking about. We're always going to try to keep it timely. We're always going to try to give you something that you can take that you did not know about or changes in the law. So, Rich, I really appreciate you spending the time, giving us the time. I know your time is so valuable, and appreciate you giving us the time for this. And we thank you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you the next time. Thank you very much.